Good morning, everyone. It's Will Anders here. Very topical one. As you know, the chamber was started back in 1969 to foster business between the United States and Brazil. And obviously, there's a lot going on in that space. There's been a recent U.S. Supreme Court decision on the IEEPA ruling. And Amadeo Ribeiro, our board member and good friend and head of our committee that brings these things together, came up with this topic and brought a great committee to discuss it. So without further ado, Amadeo, let me pass it on to you to introduce who's going to be speaking today on this very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Will, and good morning, everyone. So as Will said, my name is Amadeo Ribeiro. I'm a partner at DLA Piper. I chair the Investing in Brazil Committee, and with me today to discuss this topic are my partner, Ignacio Sanchez. He is the chair of our geopolitical risk team. He has worn many hats at DLA, including the one of chair of our trade and sanctions group. And over 30 years has been representing, for over 30 years, have been representing clients in some of the most complex and far-reaching economic sanctions and trade matters. Next, we have Scott Shaw, his vice president at the Cohen Group. Scott is a highly experienced commercial diplomat with extensive background in China, Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, and Brazil. He has a long and distinguished career at the U.S. Department of Commerce, including spending several years in Brazil as senior commercial officer. And last but certainly not least, we have Marcos Trujillo. He's a distinguished fellow at the INSEAD Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society. He is a career diplomat, an economist, and a sociologist, and a good observer, an excellent observer, I should say, of everything that's going on in the U.S.-Brazil trade relations. So with that, we have questions where I think each of you will offer an interesting perspective. So I'll direct all of our questions today to the three of you, and I'll begin with Marcos today. So Marcos, let us begin with the big picture. The U.S. Supreme Court decision restricting the use of IEEPA to impose tariffs is certainly a very important development. But it's not one that has stopped the U.S. government from pursuing a trade policy intended to reshore industry and address perceived long-term trade imbalances. Can you elaborate on this policy and even, after the Supreme Court ruling, why it still matters and very much so for Brazil?
Amadeo, it's great to be with you here, with Will, with Iggy, and Scott. Amadeo, I lived for the first time in the US as an exchange student in 1982. And I take pride in saying that I've been to the US every single year of my life this past 44 years. I have also lived in the US as a diplomat. I lived as an adjunct professor. You never know a country well, and you never know bilateral relations well. But I think I know something about it from an academic perspective, from a business perspective, and also for being, at one particular point, Brazil's trade envoy. I cannot recall a moment throughout this past 4 decades in which trade relations between the two biggest democracies of the West, the two biggest economies of our hemisphere, has been so contentious, which I think, among other things, signal to wasted opportunities. If you think that today, only from the import side, the US buys from the world about 3.6 trillion, and only around 40 billion come from Brazil prior Liberation Day and prior the letter by President Trump on July 9th, or even the investigations that are taking place under Section 301. There's underperformance in Brazil-US trade relations. And I think it shouldn't be that way, because if there is a characteristic of the past 10 years, and of course, this has been exacerbated by COVID and by what some people are terming Cold War 2.0, there has been a de-risking away from China. There has been a lesser willingness to expose yourself to that which has been the most important manufacturing jurisdiction of the world over the past 30 years. The OECD came up with some numbers last week of the flows of foreign direct investment. China, which used to be the world's number two destination, has its incoming foreign direct investment collapsing. The flow is not going to China anymore. That is because there are more restrictions in terms of exports that are coming out of China. The experience of those companies throughout COVID from operating in China has been very traumatic, but also because China is no longer a low-cost country. It's doing very well in other areas, especially tech-intensive ones. But in those areas of manufacturing where the remuneration of labor is a very important factor in determining the final competitiveness of the product, China has lost steam, and therefore companies have moved to other jurisdictions, to India, to Vietnam, to Myanmar, to Mexico, to Morocco. So this signals a very big opportunity for Brazil. Now, why is it that the current trade policy of the US is so important for Brazil? Because I think one of the objectives of those who are designing such policies is that foreign investment in manufacturing will sort of boomerang back to the US, which is happening to some extent. I think not as in a scale that the policymakers would expect. But that is not Brazil's biggest problem. The biggest problem is associated with the current US trade policy. You have a process of deregulating, cutting taxes, cutting red tape, that's going on in the US that's actually attracting a lot of investment to the US, investment that could otherwise come to Brazil. Which means that Brazil is losing out on opportunity to welcome some of that investment that's moving away from China and that's going to the US. Then there's something else. Brazil has focused too much of its export-oriented attention in Asia. As we speak, out of $2 that Brazil exports every day, one goes to Asia. Today, Brazil is exporting almost as much to Asia, minus China, minus Japan, as it is to the US or to the European Union. It's very important that we rebalance that. If there's a disconnect between the way policymakers in Washington and Brasilia see this opportunity, instead of increasing the flows of goods between the two countries, we're gonna decrease it. And I don't think that's going to be good for the US. I don't think that's going to be good for Brazil. So it's a problem that I think is much bigger than IEEPA. It is a problem that is much bigger than what's going to happen on the countdown to the elections in Brazil. And I think we are also in the risk that because of the electoral calendar in Brazil and the perception by the current administration that by taking a tough stand against the Trump administration, it might be able to absorb some political benefit from the juncture. I think we are indeed running a very important risk of things getting more complicated than going back to a scenario where businesses are expanding and opportunities are being generated. So it's a tense moment, and the work, for example, of an institution like the Brazilian American Chamber, it's more important than ever.
Thank you, Marcos. Scott, over to you. I think you're muted, Scott.
Apologies. Yes, I would agree with a number of Marcos's points. I think, you really have to look at the strong historical commercial relationship between the U.S. and the Brazil. Having lived in Brazil over two different times, over 8.5 total years, one of the most stark things about Brazil to me upon arriving was just the incredibly strong amount of U.S. investment in the Brazil industrial base that's been there for over a century. And I think you have to kind of look at the overall administration's policies in terms of this kind of reshoring and reinvestment from the perspective of the America First foreign policy, which really does kind of push for a return or a reshoring of some of these areas of overseas investment in factories and production. There were already some challenging trend lines for Brazil, I think, as companies U.S. companies in particular, have sought to cut costs by increasingly turning to kind of global platforms for production of various products. A lot of the U.S. investment in Brazil, initially at least, having been focused on the Brazilian market specifically, and then increasingly over the years on the regional South American market. But with companies already having shifted some of their priorities towards these global platforms, there was already a little bit of a pulling back of U.S. company presence, and at least in terms of additional investment in Brazil over the years that I've been living there. But additionally, I think that trend line is obviously continuing with this kind of greater awareness in the U.S. about reshoring and bringing back industrial presence back into the U.S. I think those trend lines will continue. But however, I think at the same token, as Marcos pointed out, we're the two largest democracies. We have the second largest or third largest trading relationship in the Western Hemisphere. And there are a number of reasons why I think there are bright sides as well for the U.S.-Brazil trade relationship, very much because of that long-term investment in the industrial base in Brazil, and opportunities for us to kind of work together in this new environment where we focus on things like supply chains, secure supply chains, and areas where we can cooperate together.
Thank you, Scott. You agree to agree?
Well, yeah. So I'm going to approach it a different way, because I think that Marcos and Scott have given a good explanation of the dynamic between the governments. But from my perspective, we're always worried about the clients, the companies that we represent, and what is happening. And the first thing I would say is that the Supreme Court has made this ruling. A lot of people have relaxed. They think that the tariffs are over. The tariffs are not over. There are many, many more tariffs coming. And I know we're going to get into that discussion. And I think those who are in our audience, some are aware of that. I can tell you that many American companies and foreign companies that we work with are not necessarily aware of what is in the works and headed their way. The second thing is, I'll pick up on Scott's comment. I don't think it's that hard to understand the U.S. approach. It's really embodied, in my view, in three documents. It's the America First Trade Policy, the America First Investment Policy, and the National Security Strategy. And the America First Investment Policy is a very welcoming policy. All investment is welcome, right? We're going to accelerate the process. We're going to make everything easier for you. It explains some of the things that Marco was explaining, why there's so much investment coming to the U.S. There is one caveat. You are welcome, but your welcome will be proportional to your separation from China. If you're too tied into China, and this is very explicit in the document, that's the one negative lines, or the negative theme in the document is, if you're too tied to China, you're not necessarily welcome for investment in the U.S. The trade policy is a much harsher document. It is looking at it solely from the U.S. perspective, and that's where we're seeing some of these tariffs coming out. That's why the IEEPA tariffs came out, because the president wanted to move quickly. But now he's going to rely on other authorities, and so it is the America First trade policy is still being pushed forward. It's just going to be pushed forward in a different way. And the national security policy, which has a very, very significant Latin American component. where the United States is basically saying our relationship with our allies will be dependent upon our national security interests, plain and simple. And there is certain lines in there that say words to the effect that non-hemispheric foreign actors whose interests are adverse to the United States are not welcome in the Western Hemisphere. You can say that's China, maybe Russia, maybe a few others, but it is basically targeted at China. So if you put those three together and you start to track everything that's been happening over the last year and what is going to continue to happen, it's not difficult to follow. And the executive suites and most of the Brazilian companies, American companies with business in Brazil really need to be tracking these developments in that fashion.
Thank you, Iggy. The fact of the matter is that IEEPA has been taken out of the toolbox the U.S. government can use to pursue its trade policy. But at the same time, it's also true that the U.S. Government has lots of other tools in the toolkit. So walk us through the use of Section 122 and the ongoing investigations based on Sections 301 and 232. What are these investigations about? And if things go according to plan, what will the U.S. government have achieved by the end of this process? And what's the potential impact on Brazil? I know, Ig, you have a lot to say about this, but let me start with Scott.
Sure. Happy to start off, and maybe I'll do a little bit of the academic side, and then others can comment more on the nuances as well. The IEEPA tariffs went away with the SCOTUS, with the Supreme Court ruling. That hugely affected Brazil because Brazil was one of two countries in the world with a very high IEEPA tariff following the announcements last summer. So Brazil's effective trade-weighted average tariff rate went down 13.6%. So Brazil benefited hugely from the ruling, at least initially. But with the 122 tariffs that have not been used they've been threatened before, but they've not actually been used in any sort of regular way for many years. That is a different sort of tariff authority that Congress delegated to the president that allows him to put in place this kind of almost global tariff of initially it was 10% upon initial announcement, and then that changed to 15% that went into effect on February 24th. The statutory authority for those tariffs without any additional congressional approval is 150 days. So those tariffs are in place pretty much globally through July 24th. And because of that, and because of, I'd say, not overwhelming support in the Congress for continuation of those tariffs, particularly in the U.S.'s current inflationary environment, and that combined with our own midterm elections that are coming in November of this year, I think the betting wisdom is that the administration would not be able to get us enough of a vote to keep those tariffs in place in the Congress. So they are now racing to, look at some of the more traditional tariff authorities, 301s and 232s, in order to try to replace as many of those tariffs as possible, and in effect manage to maintain kind of this America First type of trade policy through those tariffs. Now, this is a bit of a more bigger challenge because those tariffs, those two authorities in particular, have traditionally been sectorally focused. So they've looked at certain industries. They both require that the U.S. government show that the tariffs are in place because of injury brought by the foreign country and or the sector. And 301 in particular focuses on issues around like trade policy, in the case of many countries, including China, forced labor, But although they're more it's more traditional, those tariffs actually have to be legally defensible, based on a kind of a public process that involves both public hearings and public comments. And then, the administration is well aware of the fact that there's a whole big group of trade lawyers in Washington who are ready to sue the administration if those tariffs are not properly found and based in an actual investigation and injury found. So they're working very hard on that. Typically, 301 investigations can last upwards to a year. But in this case, the expectation is they will try to get the investigations wrapped up very quickly in time for the July timeframe in order to try to replace at least some of those tariffs that will expire along with the 122 tariffs. On the 232 side, that's an authority that's based around national security. It's somewhat broadly defined, national security, although in a different way, they still have to find that there's a national security basis for those tariffs. So the big difference being with the IEEPA strategy that the administration approached initially, they had a lot of authority. This had not been court tested. There was no clear basis other than the IEEPA law as to why the tariffs were in place. With 232 and 301, there's a much more statutory sort of guardrails around the approach and how they do it and all of that, which is why they didn't focus on that, at least initially. So there are some more limitations under the current approach, but the expectation is that they will be able to introduce a number of new tariffs, particularly through the 301 investigations, and then potentially through some additional 232s as well.
Excellent. This is a great overview, Scott. So, Iggy, what would you like to add?
Well, let me dig down a little bit deeper. The IEEPA tariffs is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That's really the sanctions power that the president has. The president declares a national emergency. He can immediately impose remedies. Most of the time, that's sanctions. In this case, he imposed tariffs. That's what went to the Supreme Court. Did he have the power to impose tariffs as opposed to sanctions? Because nothing in IEEPA talks about the power to impose duties. And under our Constitution, the power to tax is with Congress, unless Congress delegates it to the president. And what the Supreme Court basically found is IEEPA did not delegate to you that power. But Section 122, Section 232, and Sections 301 all delegate the power to the president. Now, the president has to follow, as Scott laid out, appropriate procedures. The reason that I point that out is that we've been hearing a lot, well, the Supreme Court's just going to declare these tariffs unconstitutional as well. If you're waiting for that to happen, you're going to wait a long time, and it's not going to happen. They are not going to say the president does not have the power to do it under those statutes. He does have the power to do it. Now, whether he's within the scope of what the law allows, there could be a lot of discussion. There could be some lawsuits challenging it. But it is a much, much, much harder case to win, to challenge the president's authority under 232, 301, or 122 than to have challenged it under IEEPA. So if you are Brazil, or you're a Brazilian entity, you need to be aware that there is a pending 301 investigation that has been in place since last spring. It is going to wrap up now. The comment period has ended, the hearings have ended, and it focuses on particular areas. It focuses on digital trade and electronic payment services, on unfair preferential tariffs, on anti-corruption enforcement, on intellectual property protection, ethanol market access, and illegal deforestation. What the record will show and how the U.S. Trade Representative then says, therefore, our remedy is we're going to impose these tariffs on Brazil. We're going to know in the next month, 2-3 months, sometime before July, we're going to know what tariffs will be imposed on Brazilian entities as a result of that investigation. There are 2 new 301 investigations, one on the basis of forced labor. 60 economies have been targeted. Brazil is one of them. There is also the excess capacity in manufacturing, where Brazil has also been targeted. Those two were the ones that were commenced right after, shortly after the 122 tariffs were put in place. And the U.S. Trade Representative has said we will have the comment period, we will have the hearings. In fact, the comments are due by next week. The hearings will happen shortly after that, and he's not going to wait a year. He just said they will come back with recommendations to the president and be ready for an announcement of remedies by July 24th. So again, if you're Brazilian entities, you have to be aware that these two are coming down the line and could potentially impact your business. And then there were a whole series of 232 investigations that got started last spring that are underway. And we just saw the pharmaceutical one being resolved, where the president basically imposed significant tariffs on the pharmaceutical industry unless you made a promise, a gesture, had already started to invest in the United States, then you got exempted from them. But those are underway, and there's about 9 other categories of 232s that will all be announced between now and September. So that's the framework of what's happening. That's why I said the tariffs have not gone away. The last thing I would say is IEEPA has not gone away either. IEEPA is still a very powerful sanctions tool. The president can sanction companies, individuals, sectors. You saw him flex that at one point when Spain did not allow some bases in Spain to be used for the war in Iran. And he threatened to impose sanctions against Spain. He obviously didn't, but the power is still there to do so. So that is still a very important tool that the president has available to him.
Thank you for pointing that out. And I think we're going to continue to talk about these investigations. Before we move to the next question, Marcos, your take.
Well, I mean, if everything comes down the way it might, the many different legal platforms that the president can reach out to, I think 4 consequences are to be expected. One, the U.S. market is just too big to ignore for Brazilian companies. If you're importing 12% of your GDP of 30 trillion, the size of U.S. imports is bigger than the GDP of France. So it is impossible for a Brazilian company to ignore it. Even difficult to penetrate, more obstacles, less obstacles, more or less tariffs, they're going to have to make a go at the U.S. market. Of course, one of the ways will be to establish operations in the U.S., make investment in the U.S. For those companies that have the capacity of capex, this is somewhat happening. But it's not going to be the dominant case. It will happen, but it will not be the dominant case. Some Brazilian companies might look into other jurisdictions. Paraguay comes to mind for at least transferring part of its manufacturing operations to that country, because it enjoys a much more welcome approach on the part of the U.S. This is happening not only because of bilateral trade relations between Brazil and the U.S., but because of other reasons, like, for example, the ease to do business, climate in Paraguay, and the heavy taxation domestically that Brazilian entrepreneurs are subject to. Then there will also be the case that some Brazilian companies acting as suppliers to American business are just too important and very difficult to replace. It's not like you're turning one light off here, you're turning up with the other supplier. They're difficult to replace. Some of it are on the value-added and specialized size. And in those cases, at the end of the day, either prices are going to be passed on to the American consumer, or the Brazilian seller and the American buyer are going to have to bear part of the cost and not pass it on entirely to the good that's going to be commercialized in the U.S. jurisdiction. And then number 4, and this I think is happening in a major extent, those Brazilian companies are looking for alternatives, right? Today is the 7th of April. In about 3 weeks, the Mercosur European Union agreement, which had been negotiated for 20 years, will enter into force. So size-wise, Europe may be in decline, but it's a $23 trillion economy Brazilians are going to have more access to the European market. Supply chains between the two regions might become more dense. So alternatives will be looked at, and this might also be an unwelcome, I think, effect of the current trade policy of the U.S.
Thank you. So before we move to the next question, I'd like to note that for those of you who would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A chat box. I am seeing a few questions. I believe, one or two we've already covered, but I'm going to leave questions for the end just because I believe that we'll cover a lot of ground and answer the questions I'm looking at right now as we go through this webinar. So the next question, I think we're going to continue the topic of the Section 301 and 232 investigations to focus more narrowly on the stakeholders in these investigations. We know the governments can play a role. We know that companies can play a role. Trade associations can play a role. What is the state of play with respect to Brazil, Iggy? We know that Brazilian companies and trade associations can support the Brazilian government. What is it that they could be doing, and what's the timeline for acting? Based on your previous comments, I think, with some of the investigations wrapping up quickly, what can they do?
Right. So as Scott laid out or stated earlier, both under 232 and 301, there is a much more formal process. Under IEEPA, the president just acted. Under 232, 301, the 301, it's U.S. Trade Representative, 232 is the Commerce Department, but the two agencies have to invoke a formal process that invites public comment, invites a public hearing. In the Section 301 context, the petition is really against the government. And so one of the steps that it takes place is that there's also a consultation process with the government. And how the government responds is very significant to how the matter ends up being resolved. In that case, as Marco said, I don't think that the situation between Brazil and the U.S. is at a positive stage where the consultation is going to resolve this matter, because I think there's a political calculus that it benefits President Lula's reelection to fight with the U.S. on these issues. So that doesn't bode well for the result. Now, they also put an accelerated process in place. There's public comment. The public comment is due by April 15th. After that, after formal comments are submitted, there will be a hearing. There'll be an opportunity to probably prepare some rebuttal comments after the hearing. But the U.S. Trade Representative, which typically will take another 9 months to solve this, has said they're going to be resolved by July 24th. The goal is to have the 122 tariffs expire after the 150 days and immediately replace them with the 301 tariffs that are in place. To me, the biggest difference between the IEEPA tariffs and the 301 232 tariffs is that the IEEPA tariffs, as whether they're constitutional or not constitutional, they were broadly based. Everybody was being hit with a number of some sort. 232 and 301 are much more specific, and therefore could be, you can have a lot of winners and a lot of losers. So it is really incumbent on industry and governments to engage and engage quickly on the 301 process. The 232s are already in place. They haven't announced new ones. They said that they will announce new ones. Those are already mature. Now it's a matter of preparing for what's to come rather than engaging and trying to influence what's to come.
Got it. So, Scott, you spent years in Brazil. You know the Brazilian industry well. If you were to advise them how to act in this context, what would be your advice?
Yeah, I think And, talking to a number of companies as well as some associations, both Brazilian and US, et cetera, um, as Iggy points out, there's a very public process involved in these investigations. The 301 investigations, in particular, provide an opportunity to provide public comments. With the timeline that they're looking at, I think a lot of especially the just announced 301 investigations, those comments are due on April 15th, so coming up very quickly. But when you're in Washington, you quickly learn that each of the times these public comment periods come up, the associations, in particular, trade associations, industry associations, are all very busily providing feedback on these various investigations. It is as Iggy points out, we're a little bit far into the process at this point, and a lot of these investigations are going to go forward regardless. But there is opportunity for individual companies and even individual Brazilian companies through that process to make comments or to point out areas where there might be some commonalities. Um, I'd say, pointing back to some of the documents that Iggy pointed out earlier, the National Security Strategy, America First policies that have been published, it's very important for companies to be thinking broadly about their role in our US trade relationship, and are there overlays of interest that could be pointed out. I would say, particularly on the national security side, that's an area that resonates very loudly with the administration and pointing out areas where Brazil could actually play an important role in important supply chain issues. Obviously, I know we're going to talk a little bit about critical minerals, but any opportunities for the US and Brazil to cooperate in those areas. But there is an undercurrent within the US administration, the interagency environment, to look not just at US supply chains, US based supply chains, but supply chains based in allied countries. And through a lot of the work that I'd done while I was in Brazil and in various sectors, the defense space, et cetera, there are a lot of common interests that could be pointed out. And there have been cases where companies have gotten exemptions or reductions based on pointing out some of those interests. So I would encourage folks to consider that as well as we go through that process.
Thank you. Marcos.
I think it's important for us, Amadeo, to sort of voice what would be the traditional approach under normal circumstances, right? Because, for example, if you think back to a very good moment in Brazil-US relations when the president of the US was Bill Clinton, the president of Brazil was Fernando Cardoso. They even had a personal, warm relationship. There was an investigation under Section 301 open against Brazil. So what would the traditional approach be? So there's a Brazilian company that feels its interests are going to be hurt. It reaches out to its sectoral representation. There are sequences of meetings scheduled with the Brazilian Ministry of Industry and Trade. You engage the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Brazilian embassy in Washington is instructed. The responsible for the trade and commercial section reaches out to the USTR, to the Department of Commerce, Department of State. This is how you do it. These traditional pipelines are not working, and I think will not work for the foreseeable future because, one, there is very little room inside the current Brazilian administration where Brazilian officials are welcome. Of course, you have to talk, but relations are very, very cold in the official side. And also because I think when some of these units try to take some initiative in trying to solve the problem, it does so in a very uncertain fashion because it is not necessarily aware that this is going to be welcomed by Brasilia itself. And I think we have already said earlier on that it might play into the current administration of Brazil's electoral objectives to keep the tension afloat. So, what can you do in those circumstances? So, I think yes, reaching out to well-established, advisory firms in DC is part of the game. You have to count on those, especially those that have connections with senior members of the U.S. administration. Making sure that you have a very close connection with your buyer, because the voice of the buyer, the American firm that it depends upon the imports of Brazilian goods, has special leverage vis-a-vis the current administration. So it's very important to, once again, organize a coalition of buyer and seller whenever that is feasible. And obviously, work on exceptions. If there's one thing that we've learned from this past 13 months of U.S. administration, is that the administration is open to exceptions, and generally the exceptions emerge when you have this business approach that coincides a continued interest in exporting to the U.S. with a well-established presence in the U.S. generating local jobs. So that has to be part of the negotiating pitch.
Excellent. Thank you, Marcos. So let's zoom out and think out of the box for a minute, considering all the many things that one can do besides participating actively in the ongoing investigations. What are some of the other components that, in your view, would create a strong strategy that Brazilian stakeholders may pursue to defend their interests? So I'm going to start with you, Iggy.
Well, I think Marcos just described some of that, but I think that I want to sort of flip this around a little bit. I don't think this is all doom and gloom, right? I don't think this is all necessarily about the problems that are coming. My sense is that historically there was not the need to necessarily individually engage in Washington, and engagement can be. There are very different grades of engagement. There can be very direct engagement. There can be just engagement for purposes of understanding and monitoring and reacting. But at the end of the day, I think that most of the businesses need to really understand what is happening and how it's happening and the timeline under which it's going to happen, and then identify the risks, but also the opportunities. So we've talked a lot about the supply chain issues. A big part of that national security strategy, a big part of this trade and investment strategy focuses on the U.S.'s need to break its dependency on China. And so where does Brazil fit in? And is there opportunities there? And how do you make yourself a key player and take advantage of that as an opportunity? The governments may move in different directions, but the issue for the businesses is, am I looking out for my own interest in making sure that I am going to identify and react to risk, but also take advantage of the opportunities? And that's where I think the biggest focus should be. I've seen it in very significant measure from the Korean and the Japanese companies who, I would say 10 years ago, were not active at all in Washington, had no sense of what was happening there, didn't have representatives, didn't have advisors. They are all over Washington. They see every move that happens, they react accordingly. Brazil is a sophisticated has a sophisticated business community that should be doing the same.
I hear you. So, Scott, what else then should Brazilian companies and the business community at large be doing?
You're muted, Scott.
Dylan.
All right. Again, I would emphasize that I think Brazilian companies should think broadly about overall U.S. interests and the administration's focus on national security and other areas where we have commonalities. Brazil is very fortunate to be included within sort of the administration's focus on the Western Hemisphere under the national security strategy and kind of the core perimeter of our national security strategy being this hemisphere. So if we're able to, if companies can pursue a strategy through their associations or through other bigger trade groups, pointing out some of the strengths of the long-term ties between our industrial bases, that could be an effective argument as we approach a lot of these different issues. I think there's obviously a lot of commonality beyond any of the politics of the moment. And those are, some of these cultural and commercial ties are, as I said, over 100 years old. And so I think there's a big opportunity to kind of express the strength and the stability of the U.S.-Brazil commercial relationship. Brazil is one of our largest trading partners, and it's actually a country where the U.S. actually had a trade surplus for many, many years. And so, that's another key point to be emphasizing to the U.S. administration that's very focused on trade deficits and trade surpluses with major trading partners, being able to show that, Brazil has in many ways been a partner commercially, and how Brazilian companies can kind of fit within that construct to support sort of secure and stable supply chains going forward.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Marcos.
I'll just make the connection between trade and investment here because earlier in our conversation, I had made reference to how foreign direct investment is decreasing towards China. And I think it's very important to highlight that according to the OECD, over the past 4 years, so the last 2 years of the Bolsonaro administration, 2 first years of the current administration, Brazil has moved up to become the second biggest destination for foreign direct investment because there are changes in the global order in geopolitics that make food security, energy security, and now this big issue of critical minerals more and more strategic. And to my concern, when you see the sources of investment that are coming into those sectors to establish joint ventures, joint opportunities, and of course also trade, the U.S. is playing less and less of a role. So if the question before us is what else can we do? What other opportunities? So it is about trade promotion. It is about trying to remove obstacles from the trade agenda, but it's also presenting projects and opportunities that relate to joint investment that can be attracted as a result of the priority the new geopolitical scenario attaches to any of these to all of these points that I made a reference to.
Let me jump in right behind that very quick because I'll point out a significant fact. The U.S. Development Financial Corporation, right, which had a $60 billion cap for purposes of stimulating investments, was when Congress went through the National Defense Authorization Act last December and increased it to $206 billion on the basis that the DFC needed to look at countries like Brazil and stimulate investment. And the purpose for the increase was that the increase needed to reflect the importance of national security priorities and how the U.S. stimulated investment abroad. So that's an example of having a strategy and trying to figure out, where there might be opportunity to bring investment into Brazil. And just to get a little granular, right? you have to think in terms of, or Brazilians should be thinking in terms of the following. And Amadeo, you and I have had these discussions before in Brazil. Brazil is Florida's number one trading partner, right? The Secretary of State is a Floridian who fully and completely understands that. Marco Rubio is from Miami, Florida. He understands that. The Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, is a Floridian and fully understands that. And the president and his family are now Floridians, right? Byron Donald, a member of Congress who's a great ally of the president, is running for governor. What does Byron Donald think about Brazil? And how might companies create a relationship with Byron Donald, who will become a very important voice for the next 2 years after the elections with President Trump? These are the kinds of things that companies should be thinking about. Don't go to Washington and ask for help after there's a problem. Go to Washington and develop relationships before you have a problem, because then it's a lot easier to ask for help from a friend rather than asking for help from someone who doesn't know who you are and is going to say, who are you? Why are you here? And why have I never heard from you before?
Yes, I hear you, Iggy, and I've heard you say this before. Now, it sounds like a proactive strategy can obviously involve representation in the Section 301 and 232 investigations that we talked about. But it can also involve a number of different things, including advocating for investments in sectors where it makes sense from the standpoint of the U.S. national security strategy to support ties between Brazil and the U.S. So let us get a little more granular and talk about some of the sectors that fit into that context. And I'm going to start with you, Marcos. If you were to highlight sectors that can benefit particularly from this dynamic, what would you say?
There is this professor at MIT, Mihaela Papa, and she does wonderful research on the connection between areas like artificial intelligence, data centers, cryptocurrencies, and the consumption of energy. There's a new wave of energy-related investment that is targeted at technology that might use many of the energy opportunities that Brazil offers in hydro and solar. This is basically untouched upon, although very important voices like that of Hank Paulson or even Secretary of State Marco Rubio in conversations with Congress, then mentioned the potential of South America, sometimes even referring to Paraguay as an important destination of investment. I think Brazil and the US can play a very important role. Partnerships in exploring those inputs that are essential to the science and the economy of the 21st century, critical minerals. Of course, there is not a single update of the compilation made by the United States Geological Survey as far as the geographical sources of rare earths, critical minerals are concerned, where Brazil is not featured in second place. We have the reserves, we have proved reserves. There's much more to be revealed, but we lack the capex, and I think very little sectors play as much a priority role as that one in the attention of the current administration. And I also think there is a new wave of focus that's coming to the defense industry. At one particular point, Brazil has already been the third biggest manufacturer the third biggest exporter of the defense industry. We might be talking about an international context that invites that opportunity again. Some of that also in partnership with the U.S. firms.
Thank you, Marcos. Iggy, back to you.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. I also would say, food security is a big part of national security. There's an opportunity there for Brazil, and for sophisticated Brazilian entities who are players who can not only play in Brazil but can play in other parts of Latin America where they have investments. So I think that's something that should not be lost um, uh, from a going forward and identifying opportunities perspective. I had a meeting recently with someone who was in the mining sector, and it sounded quaint and old fashioned, but they were talking about copper and how important copper was, and basically they said you can't make any product that we rely on in the world without copper, right? And so you have to really break it down to the basics again.
Yes, I agree. So Scott, any other sectors you would single out?
No, I would agree. There are some key sectors that have been mentioned. Obviously, um, another area that we already have incredible cooperation on is in commercial aircraft with Embraer. Some 60+ % of an Embraer aircraft is US based parts and imports. And so that's a great example of a sector where there was, during the IEEPA tariffs, Embraer actually was successful through a good strategy of getting an exemption for some of the parts and components for commercial aircraft. So an area where we have clear overlay of interests. Iggy's mention of copper is obviously a key area as well, but other potential critical minerals, I think, as well. Advanced manufacturing, I think there's an opportunity, as well as I think Marcos also mentioned the defense industrial base, an area we've done a lot of cooperative work with and as well.
Thank you, Scott. So we have about 4 minutes left, and I believe we've covered most of the questions in the Q&A chat box, but I will try to merge them into one final question that I have for you guys, which is, we know we have the ongoing investigations, we had the Supreme Court ruling, so we've talked about that, but there's several other aspects of the Brazil-US relationship that matter just as much for trade between the two countries. And to begin with, we have the upcoming elections in both countries, right? We have the midterms in the US, we have the presidential election in Brazil. The relationship with China that we have covered already also matters tremendously. Equally important is the extent to which Brazil is willing to assist the US on critical minerals and other areas that are important for US national security. And to throw into that discussion one more aspect that our board member Carlos Guimarães has added in the chat box. He talks about the political differences that Brazil and the US may have, given Brazil's support for previously, Chavez, and then Maduro, and Cuba, Russia, China. And so Brazil's foreign policy being perhaps perceived as unfriendly, is that another factor that we should all be considering? So the list is long. If you were to summarize what, in your view, the key factors are and how they will impact the future of Brazil-US trade relations, I know it's a big question, but let me go first to you, Scott. And you have 1 minute.
No, I would say, I think the thing that strikes me as common between our two countries is very intense politics in both countries. I've experienced both places, and yet having been there having lived in Brazil under both left government and a rightist government, I think what I would say is that the commonalities and the ability of the two countries to see commonalities through face-to-face contact. We had a number of different forums while I was in Brazil, the Defense Industrial Dialogue, Commercial Dialogue, CEO Forum, and other forums. There are a lot of ways that we can, despite our politics, find common cause. And I think Brazil has a significant opportunity to continue to pursue that in a proactive manner, despite either government's politics. How's that for a minute?
I like the positive tone. So, Iggy, you only have 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think the U.S.-China divide, you know, I think Marcos called it the Cold War 2.0. It's an economic Cold War. The question really will be, where does the Brazilian government fall on that? Does it stay neutral? Does it lean one way or the other? That has a significant impact on the relationship between the two countries. But independent of where the government falls, businesses have to take care of themselves. And I think that's really the message that I would deliver. Look for, be smart, understand what's happening, take advantage of opportunities, and prepare for and mitigate the risks that result from that divide.
It's an excellent point. So, Marcos, the final word to you.
Well, Amadeus, think back of July 2025. The Brazilian president's stance in public opinion polls was facing a downward spiral. His numbers were going down, 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 and then the Trump's letter was sent out. It sort of made public opinion in Brazil that the current administration was embracing this yellow and green nationalistic position, and that helped Lula sort of revert what was a very negative trend towards him. That has once again been reversed. So Lula once again is in the decline. The temptation to re-embrace that template over the next couple of weeks, if bad news emerged from all of these investigations and trade measures that we have discussed today, are a reality, unproductive as it is, and not to the benefit of the Brazilian national interest as it is, I think this will be a complicating factor because the current administration in Brazil will once again voice a Brazilian sovereignty first stance that will only make things more complicated.
Yeah. So in my mind, that only reinforces Iggy's point, which is that companies need to be smart and develop their own strategy. So with that, and with immense gratitude to you, speakers, we'll end this webinar. I hope it was interesting to those of you listening, and this conversation will continue. Thank you.